Yeah, I always hate that awkward, is it morning or afternoon dilemma on webcasts. So I'll just say good day, mate, in honor of our Australian colleagues who worked with us on this project and couldn't be on this webinar. It's, of course, rather late at night there. We are here today to talk about retirement readiness, focusing on the results of a survey we undertook in Australia, the UK, and the US. My name is Ken Holman. I'm a consulting actuary with the firm of Finley Davies, BPS&M in our Louisville office, and I'm a past president of the American Academy of Actuaries. I'm going to be your moderator, as Gerald said. With me today are Rebecca Deegan, who is a policy manager at the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries in the UK and joins us from London. Ted Goldman is the Senior Pension Fellow at the American Academy of Actuaries and joins us from the Academy offices in Washington, D.C., where he's joined by Steve Jackson, who is the Assistant Director for Research at the Academy. I want to say, first of all, we all owe a big debt of gratitude to Steve for his work in slicing and dicing and analyzing the data from our survey and developing a plan for the resulting report. Steve will be watching for any questions you may have during this presentation, which you can submit through the Q&A tab on the screen, and I'm sure he'll interject any pearls of wisdom he sees fit during the presentation. So here's our agenda for this presentation. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the headlines from our report, along with a brief introduction as to how we got here, as well as a few details on the underlying data and methodology used in the survey. I'll then turn it over to Rebecca to go through some of the results, and she'll then pass the baton to Ted, who will summarize the key takeaways from our analysis. So let's start with the headlines from our report. First, we have three very different countries, three different cultures, three different approaches to retirement policy. But we found surprisingly similar results across our three countries. Second, we discovered in all three countries that we've done a fair job of getting people to understand the need to save for retirement during the accumulation phase. But that doesn't always correspond to people taking appropriate action. And perhaps most troubling, developing and following a good plan for the decumulation phase of retirement has proven extremely evasive. So how did our three actuarial associations from around the globe come together for this project? Let me set the stage with a little bit of background. The first germ of this project surfaced about 4 years ago. In my role as International Secretary for the Academy, I was meeting with my counterpart from the Actuaries Institute from Australia, just a great gentleman named Martin Stevenson, and we were looking for areas of common concern where we might collaborate. And I mentioned some work the Academy was doing regarding the loss of lifetime income corresponding with kind of that retirement paradigm shift from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans in the United States. Martin almost leapt out of his seat and said that was a huge concern in Australia. Well, about the same time, I was meeting with representatives from the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries from the UK, and it had just been announced that the British government was going to eliminate the requirement that defined contribution plan balances be at least partially annuitized. So they had a requirement of partial annuitization of defined contribution balances, and were eliminating that. So it's my understanding from my British colleagues that this decision was very highly politicized and created quite a firestorm in the media and the public. And so the loss of lifetime income was now a major concern to the Institute and faculty. That led to a collaboration between our three associations that resulted in a paper entitled "The Challenge of Longevity Risk, Making Retirement Income Last a Lifetime." And this was published in late 2015. And link to that paper can be found on this page in the handout, both through the Academy and through the Institute and faculty. And this paper received some very good media attention in all three countries. And so our little trilateral group began to wonder about the relative preparedness for retirement in our three countries. And we decided to undertake a survey in late 2016. And before we jump into the results of the survey, it might be helpful to first look at some of the comparisons between our countries. First, here's some basic demographic statistics regarding the three countries. The age dependency ratio is the number of people over age 65 divided by the number of working age individuals. And you can see that the U.S. and Australia are pretty comparable, but the UK has a higher age dependency ratio. Next, you can see that the percentage of people over that traditional retirement age of 65 who are still working ranges from 21% in the UK to 30% in the U.S., with Australia pretty much in the middle. And lastly, what percentage of a country's GDP is being spent annually on those over age 65? And we see that the U.S. is the highest at 6.7%, the UK's just a little behind that at 5.6%, and Australia is significantly less at 3.5%. So the UK has a somewhat older population, the U.S. has more people working at older ages, and Australia spends less on the elderly. We were also curious as to the effect different national cultures might have on the preparation for retirement. And again, I have to give props to Steve Jackson for uncovering some research by the Dutch social psychologist Gert Hofstede. And according to Dr. Hofstede, Americans and Australians are more likely to avoid uncertainty than are the British. And by uncertainty, we mean, for example, how much do I need for my retirement? And it's an increasingly uncertain concept. Also, the British tend to have a longer-term view of things than do the Americans and the Aussies. Clearly an important cultural difference when it comes to retirement planning. So in addition, the three countries have different retirement structures that certainly impact retirement readiness. Australia has a heavily means-tested social safety net for the elderly, and that's funded through general tax revenues. And that's paired with a mandatory, underlined mandatory, employer-provided retirement benefit, and this is referred to as the superannuation guarantee. I think this started back in around 1992 at a 3% employer contribution rate. It's now at a 9.5% contribution rate, and it's scheduled to increase to 12% by 2025. Australians also have the opportunity to accumulate tax-favored personal savings for retirement. And I'll also note that Australia really started its kind of retirement transformation from defined benefit to defined contribution roughly a generation before the UK and the US started theirs. Rebecca, do you want to describe the UK system?
Sure. So in terms of the transition from defined benefit to defined contribution here in the UK, as of 2016, 85% of defined benefit schemes were closed to new members or both new members and new accruals. And this is in contrast to the number of DC savers rising rapidly here in the UK. By 2020, it's expected that over 10 million more people are going to be saving as a result of automatic enrolment. Now, we're some way behind Australia in that the current minimum contribution rate for auto-enrolment is just 2%, with plans to increase it to 8% by April 2019. We've also seen the introduction of other fundamental reforms here in the UK. In April last year, the UK government introduced the new state pension, and the new state pension is single-tiered. Previously, we had two tiers, and it was introduced to provide simple, flat rate support above the basic level of means-tested support. And the uprating of the new state pension is referred to as a triple lock, and this triple lock has caused a significant amount of controversy in the media over here in the UK as to whether it's sustainable, as the triple lock ensures that the state pension rises with either inflation, earnings, or 2.5% per annum, whichever's highest. And then finally, I couldn't give you an overview of the UK pension system without mentioning that largely unanticipated freedom and choice reforms that were announced in the 2014 budget. these reforms, as Ken mentioned, changed the tax framework here in the UK. The tax framework previously applied a 55% tax charge on lump sum withdrawals, except from in limited circumstances, and so promoted the purchase of annuities. Whereas now people can make withdrawals from their DC pension pots pretty much however they want, subject to their marginal rate of income tax that year.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. Ted, what about the U.S.?
Yeah, in the U.S., briefly touch on the similar three tiers going across. First, we have our Social Security program, which is generally highly regarded and working well. It's progressive in that it provides higher replacement income levels at the lower income people than the higher as income goes up. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the challenges that Social Security is going to be facing in terms of solvency issues by 2034 is the projected date. And the employer-provided arena, we have also moved from DB to DC in the private corporate single employer sector, and DB plans are still hanging on in there for the public sector, many public sector employers, and in what we call our multi-employer union programs as well. Both of those have some problems that they're dealing with that are creating some pretty fantastic headlines in the public sector and multi-employer issues. We could spend all day talking about that. With respect to the move from DB to DC, we're seeing we do not have any mandatory, unlike Australia and now the UK, we do not have automatic enrollment programs, but we do have the voluntary automatic features that the employers can adopt. Those are gaining in prevalence. The larger plans in particular, I think, are close to 50% of the people have automatic features. And we're seeing automatic enrollment. They started out at around 3% with auto-escalation in some cases, trying to get those savings rates to go higher and higher. So it's an area to keep an eye on. One issue we still have in the Tier 2 is access. And while a lot of employers offer plans, there's still a lot of individuals that either work for organizations that don't have it or small employers that don't have access to an employer-provided plan, close to 50% of the population. And data shows that those people who do have access to employer plans are much more likely to save than those that don't. And then on the Tier 3, we do have our individual retirement account tax-favored savings programs. There's interestingly a lot of assets in those programs, but most of those assets are a result of rollovers from their company defined contribution plans into the personal savings accounts, and there's very little personal savings that's going on top of that. And then I also think Tier 3 is a place to watch with more new and innovative ways of people generating income. For example, in this Uber-type economy, with people being able to generate income through personal services linked through the internet. So it should be interesting to watch. That's where we are in the U.S., Ken.
Thanks, Ted. I'll just point out that these systems are covered in more detail in the appendix of our original paper. And again, I'd encourage you to take a look at that. So how does this relate to replacement ratios at various income levels in the three countries? Ted kind of hit on this with our Social Security in the U.S. But when you consider the national systems and the mandatory employer-provided systems, which by mandatory I'm only including Australia there, we see some similarities but also significant differences. We've looked at three compensation levels here: 50% of the national average income, 100%, and 150% of the national average. And we find that Australia provides the greatest replacement, which isn't surprising at all since this includes the majority of their employer-provided benefits. The UK is at the lowest level in all three income levels, and the US is very close to the UK at the lower income levels, but moves closer to Australia as income increases. So this all kind of begged the question to us. Recognizing important differences across the three countries, are there profound differences in the perception of planning for a secure retirement? And this led to the decision by the Actuaries Institute in Australia, the IFOA, and the Academy to undertake this survey. Let me quickly describe our survey methodology. Our survey sampled the working age population, ages 18 to 64, in the 3 countries. And we obtained sufficient information to be able to analyze the results by country, by age, by gender, and by income. Aside from the demographic information, we asked 16 multiple choice questions related to the respondents' preparations for retirement. And you'll see here an example of one of the questions, but a listing of all the questions can be found in the appendix to our survey paper, and you'll see a link to that later. I've just shown one sample question here that deals with the expectation people have about their retirement income. But we did find that our 16 questions kind of fell into 3 distinct categories. And those were, number 1, the retirement transformation. That is, has our view of retirement changed from what it was before? Next, preparing for retirement. Do we need to know what we need to be doing, and primarily in the accumulation phase of retirement, are we doing that? And lastly, are we addressing retirement risks, which are primarily found in the decumulation period of retirement? So before I hand it over to Rebecca and Ted to discuss our findings, I'll just mention that when I read survey results, I'm frequently reminded of a bumper sticker I saw years ago that read 67.3% of all statistics are made up on the spot. And I assure you, none of our statistics are made up, but they also should not be taken just at face value. I think Dr. Hofstede's work suggests that the national cultures might mean that people view the same question very differently. So do I actually feel secure about my retirement? Or is my focus so short-term that I can't think about where I might be 10, 15 years from now? Or do I feel confident I can retire at age 65, or do I just want to avoid thinking about the alternative to that? So I think our results may have touched on some cultural differences between the old world and the new world. So with that caveat, Rebecca, I'll hand it over to you to lead us through the results of the survey.
Thanks, Ken. And as the only non-actuary of the presenters, it's my pleasure to handle the numbers section of the presentation. There's quite a few charts here and a lot of numbers, but for people joining our call, I'm sure that these won't pose any problem. But if anything is not clear, please feel free to ask further questions during the Q&A. Otherwise, the charts and full analysis of the results are contained in the body of the main report. I'm going to run you through the results, category at a time, so starting with the retirement transformation, moving on to preparing for retirement, and then the ability to address retirement risks. So the first of those. So the retirement transformation. Here we wanted to assess how changes in the pensions landscape and economic climate in each of the 3 countries are affecting individuals' expectations about their retirement. We started by asking the respondents the really basic question of, do you plan to retire? And for those that did, we then asked them how and when they plan to retire, to see whether people were planning to have a single transition point between working life and retirement, or whether their plans were to retire more gradually and in phases, and therefore perhaps later. As well as their anticipated approach to retirement, we also wanted to know what their expectations were in terms of their lifestyle in retirement, and whether future retirees are positive or not about what their life in retirement will be like. We also included sources of income in this section, as we wanted to assess whether people are expecting to have income from a range of sources, and what, if any, provision they were making themselves above Social Security from the state or from employer contributions to a pension. So what did we find? This chart shows the responses to our first 4 questions, grouped by country. So the blue bars show the results from Australia, the red bars from the UK, and the green ones from the US. And if you look at the first set of bars on the left above the axes labelled plan to retire, you'll see that the majority of people do still plan to retire rather than continuing to work for their whole life, which is not that surprising. And across all three countries, on average, 70% of respondents still plan to retire. The UK respondents were most likely to be planning to retire, with 75% of them saying yes to this, compared to 60% in the US, which had the lowest percentage of respondents planning to retire. If we now look at the second set of bars, so above the label retire fully, we can see that when we asked those respondents who said that they plan to retire, whether they plan to leave the workforce and transition into retirement at a single point in time, or whether they plan to retire gradually and in stages, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, on average across the three countries, only 27% of respondents are planning to have that single point in time when they retire, and the remainder are planning to retire gradually, I'm not sure. And if we combine the results of the first two bars together, I think it's interesting that whilst US respondents were least likely to be planning to retire, if they were planning to, they were most likely to be planning to have a single point of transition between working life and in retirement. So moving on to the third set of bars, so in addition to how people plan to retire, we wanted to know when they plan to retire. And as you'd expect, the majority of respondents selected between 60 and 69 when age-related social security benefits begin to be paid in all three countries. However, a sizable proportion of respondents were anticipating working into their 70s, with a high of 27% in the US and a low of 22% in Australia. And finally, the bars on the right-hand side of the chart show the percentage of respondents who are expecting a flourishing or comfortable lifestyle in retirement. The other options that were given were modest and poor. And here we see relatively similar results in Australia and the US, with 46 and 47% respectively expecting a flourishing or comfortable life in retirement. And this compares to just 36% of UK respondents selecting either of these options. So 10% fewer respondents in the UK felt positive about their likely lifestyle in retirement. On to the next chart. So for all of the results, we tried to break them down and look at the results by age, income, and gender. And these charts show the breakdown by those for the question we asked regarding lifestyle. So what lifestyle are you expecting in retirement? Flourishing, comfortable, modest, or poor? And if you look at the chart on the bottom of the left-hand side of the slide, as you might expect, expectations for retirement improve as income increases. But as you can see from the chart on the top left, they did not differ much between age categories, which suggests that age is not as big a factor in people's expectations for retirement, and that expectations do not necessarily improve as people approach retirement. Finally, we found expectations to be highly gender biased, with male respondents having greater expectations than females. And this is the pattern that we're going to come to see again and again as we move through the results. And finally, for this section, this chart shows the different sources of income that the respondents are expecting to receive during their retirement. And we allowed the participants to select as many or as few of these options as they wanted. And there's a lot of information to try and take in here, but you should be able to notice that there's similar patterns across all three countries in regards to anticipated sources of income in retirement. And if I could just draw your attention to the top three bars, so where it says state pension, social security, and age pension, we thought it was noteworthy that well below 100% of respondents selected state pension stroke social security, despite these being almost universal benefits. And we wanted to find out who was not responding that they would have this as a source of income in retirement. And we found that it was the youngest cohorts who were least likely to select this option, and this perhaps reflects some scepticism as to whether as to the sustainability of government-backed benefits. What you will notice is that encouragingly, so there is some good news, around half of respondents selected employer-provided benefits, and they selected personal contributions to a pension, as well as personal savings. So this shows that whilst there is still some way to go, the respondents were expecting retirement income from a range of sources and were making some provision themselves. So that's the retirement transformation. Let's move on to the second of our themes, which was preparing to retire. Now, there's many different ways people can prepare for retirement, and each of them requiring some level of engagement. although some ways of preparing will require greater levels of engagement than others. So we wanted to ask questions around 4 ways of preparing. The first step was around educating yourself, so gathering information, perhaps reading information provided to you by your pension provider or your employer about your pension, and then starting to save. And these are undoubtedly vital steps, but we wanted to go a bit further than that and assess whether people knew how much they needed to save, because this will be important for them if they're going to have enough money to meet their plans and expectations. And finally, in this section, we included a question to see whether people are doing anything at all to mitigate the risk of an unexpected early retirement. For example, if they were forced to stop working due to ill health. This could, for many, and particularly those respondents who said that they plan to work into their 70s, be a critical part of their overall preparations for retirement. Again, a little bit more, somewhat good news. In every country, more than half of our respondents reported that they'd at least done something to prepare for retirement. And again, there's quite a lot we could take from these charts. If you look at the bars on the left-hand side for each country, so number 1, this shows whether people are educating themselves. And bar 2 shows whether they're saving. Bar 3, whether they know how much they need to save. And bar 4, whether they have any contingencies in place. If you look at bars 1, 2, and 3 across the 3 countries, you'll notice that the US is faring better than either the UK or Australia. And if you look at bar 4, Australia is faring better than either the UK or America in having contingencies in place. And that means it becomes apparent that, unfortunately, the UK showed least signs of preparation across all 4 questions about preparing for retirement. But despite these differences in overall levels of preparation between the countries, you can see again that there's some similar patterns across the 3. In all 3 countries, getting more educated and saving were the most likely actions, and the relatively high prevalence of respondents doing something to educate themselves about retirement suggests that there is some opportunity for engagement ahead of retirement. On the other hand, the low level of understanding about how much money people plan to retire with and what they would do if they had to leave employment earlier than anticipated does give cause for concern as to whether people are saving adequately. And again, we break these results down by age, income, and gender. The charts here show the levels of preparation as people get older. Unsurprisingly, as people approach retirement, their overall level of preparedness increases, though it worryingly only peaks at approximately 60% in Australia and the US and closer to 50% in the UK. As the chart shows, there is a lack of preparation amongst all age groups, but we were particularly concerned that less than half of those in the middle age range, so those aged 35 to 54, the middle 3 bars, were preparing. So it was just 48% of those in the US, 43% in Australia, and just 35% in the UK. This group still has time to prepare, but the longer they wait, the more difficult it becomes to save adequately and make those preparations simply due to shortened time horizons. A similar trend was seen by income, whereby overall across the 3 countries, the percentage of respondents preparing for retirement increases with income. So from roughly 30% of lower income households doing something to prepare for their retirement, compared to 45% of those from middle income households and 60% of those from higher income households. As with the middle age group, the lack of preparedness amongst those in the middle income group concerned us, as less than half of those, so 45% of those in the middle income range, are preparing to retire. Yet they're a group that are likely to stand to really benefit or worse, lose out if they don't prepare adequately. And finally, again, preparing for retirement appears to be gender biased. It's more common among males than females in all 3 countries to be doing something to prepare for retirement. In aggregate, 47% of men compared to 34% of women are preparing to retire. And now we're on to the results of our 3rd theme, the ability to address retirement risks. So having ascertained what individuals were doing to prepare, for their retirement, we wanted to gain insight into how much individuals knew about the key risks they would face when turning those savings into retirement income, and really importantly, managing that income so that they did not run out of money. To assess this, we asked respondents whether they knew how long the savings they had would last in retirement and how they planned to budget. We then asked what they would do if one of a number of unforeseen situations arose, so living longer than they might expect, a sudden drop in assets, for example, if there was another financial crisis, and if they developed care needs and therefore had to meet the associated costs. And you'll see from the chart that yet again, we in the UK fare worst in our preparations for all retirement risks. But again, we see very similar patterns across all three countries, with the implications of a drop in assets being most well understood in all three countries compared to the other risks. Although when we probed our respondents, it turned out that the vast majority of them, their preparation consisted of them planning to return to work. And this may or may not be a realistic option, depending on their age and their health at the time of the drop in value. In addition, as with the preparing to retire theme, where knowing how much they needed to save had the lowest level of preparation, respondents fared particularly poorly in knowing how long any savings they did have would last. And we're on to the final chart now. And again, we looked at retirement risks across age, gender and income. And the chart here shows that in all three countries, males reported higher levels of preparation than females. For both men and women respondents in Australia and the US, they indicated preparing with approximately the same percentages, with 72% of men in Australia and 76% of men in the US saying they were able to address at least some retirement risks, and 59% of women in Australia and 60% of women in the US saying that they were able to do so. And again, these levels are much lower in the UK, with just 50% of men and 51% of women being able to address any of our retirement risks. Though one positive for the UK, the gap between men and women is less pronounced than in either the US or Australia, suggesting slightly less gender bias here in this respect. Again, we did find preparations for retirement risks to increase amongst older respondents, though that increase was small. There was particularly little difference between the younger and middle-aged respondents, with a low of 51% for those aged 18 to 34, and it rose to 56% for those aged 35 to 54, and then to 62% for those respondents aged 55 or over, so still almost 40% not preparing. And again, we saw preparations increasing with income, from a low of 51% for those from low-income households to 59% for those from middle-income households and 63% of those from high-income households. Having looked at the results and tried to highlight some of the key findings, I'm going to hand you over to Ted, who's going to walk you through our analysis and the resulting conclusions and policy recommendations in our report.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. I think you did a fantastic job with the numbers, and you should start worrying about yourself. I think you're hanging around with the actuaries too much. So please be careful. So I'm going to take a step back now and try to make sense of all this information that we found. And to be honest, as we started to pour through the results, and as you cut this by age, income, gender, and so forth, it turns out to be, even though there were 16 questions, a lot of rich information that we stumbled upon. And my first reaction was, boy, did we learn anything? Is this a bit of a yawn? And that is anybody going to be surprised that people are not preparing well for retirement? And kind of leads to the question of, I just find the more I've looked at this, the more fascinated I've become with the results. And the more I've been drawn to a conclusion that people are people. You know, as we've said before, 3 different countries, 3 different cultures, 3 different approaches to solving or helping people address the retirement issues, yet very similar results across all 3 of these great countries. And that must mean that it has something to do with how people approach this issue. There's a noted behavioral scientist, a guy named Richard Thaler, who actually recently got some recognition for his work, that equated saving for retirement to asking people to build their own cars. And if anybody's like me out there, if I were to open my front door one day and see all the parts of my car strewn across my front lawn, I would immediately break out into a cold sweat and not have a clue how to put that back together. Yet, I know how to drive a car and I know I need to get places. So I think retirement is very similar to that. People know they need to retire, which is what we heard, but their ability to do that is still needs a lot of help and support. And so I think the behavior part jumps out the page at me. We did come up with essentially 9 high-level conclusions that I will walk you through. And the first one is that we moved from this in all 3 countries from a defined benefit to defined contribution environment. We've gotten there different ways. Australia has been there a lot longer than the UK and US, and yet there's very low expectations and preparation across all 3 countries. So that's kind of the first headline that came out of this. Again, implying, why is that? And I think if you dig deeper, there are explanations. I think, and I'll talk a little bit later about the future and what we might expect. The second conclusion is that most people plan to retire gradually, as Rebecca walked through the stats, not fully, which means people are really speaking with their feet. They're really doing. I think we're starting to see these trends come to life. Even though we polled people who are not quite at retirement, this is where people are headed, and we're going to see more people expect to continue to work, although we found, too, when managing risk, not everybody may have that choice. And the one that I find really interesting is that the expectations about a comfortable lifestyle in retirement, I thought were almost a defeatist attitude, again, seen in all 3 countries, of people saying, well, I guess I can't get there, so I'm going to not expect to be there, not expect to have, terminology we often use. Retirement studies is maintain same standard of living that you enjoyed before retirement, and the data is showing people are not even stepping up to say, I want to continue the same lifestyle I had before. So really interesting. The third one says that the best results relate to saving. So people understand the concepts. That's not the hard part. People know one day I'm going to retire. I'm going to want to retire. I'm not going to want to work as much, if at all. And so they get that part. And they are. I think we're making headway into people actually doing some thinking around that and starting to understand that need. However, the largest deficiency, going to the fourth one, is knowing how much is needed to retire on, how long it will last, and how to prepare for those risks. I think if we were to walk up and down any of the streets in the UK or the US today and ask people, do you know how much you need to save in retirement? And I'm willing to say, even if I walk the halls of the American Academy of Actuaries, people would say, well, I haven't really calculated that yet. And I put people in a couple of categories. There's some people that no matter how much information we help them, we provide them, no matter how many tools we offer, they're just going to break out in a cold sweat like I would if my car was on my front lawn and say, this just isn't something that I want to deal with. There's another, and that's a large part of the population in all 3 countries, there's another group that's perfectly capable of doing this analysis and research and calculations, but they don't. They get caught up in their day-to-day lives, and I'm actually, if you hear somebody spend even one weekend thinking about retirement and putting together a plan, that's impressive. But how often do they go back to those plans once they make that one initial effort? And then there's a third group of the population that is able to, they're good at it, and they actually do it. I could argue how good or bad a job they do of that, but there is a group that is on top of their game and thinking about and actually planning appropriately for retirement. The fifth conclusion, we found that the middle age and middle income respondents are not feeling prepared, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time. I've got a slide dedicated to that in a minute, but that has some interesting implications. We talked about all three countries showing a lack of retirement readiness, and I think the data showed that Rebecca walks through the UK is lagging, and I'll let Rebecca talk to that in a little bit too about why that might be. And the other one is the gender difference. While I would have expected that at the older ages, we're still seeing a pretty significant gender difference at the younger ages, and that surprised me a little bit. But then you start to wonder, the question mark summary, are some groups more candid than others? You get into some of the cultural differences, some of the gender differences. Are women more apt to be more candid about their preparedness, and men overstate their preparedness, or vice versa? So there's a lot of questions that raises, but I still think we have a way to go. This weekend, I saw the movie that just came out in the U.S. called Battle of the Sexes that maybe many will remember. Bobby Riggs played Billie Jean King in tennis back in the early 70s, and it was actually a pretty interesting movie. And I think we've come a long way on those fronts, but with respect to retirement planning, it seems that we still need some Billie Jean Kings out there to move the needle forward and continue to push preparedness for everybody. And then the last one is that I think on a very positive note, a lot of changes have been made in all three countries. We've seen the movement from DB to DC. We've seen the evolution of solutions, and I think it's too soon to say that to claim defeat here. I have actually some pretty optimistic views of the amount of assets in the retirement accounts today. The increase in savings, the increase in visibility seems to be more of a topic. And with superannuation increasing their contribution rates, the UK system expecting to increase contribution rates, I think when we get to populations, demographics that have lived their entire working lives at these higher rates, we may actually see some marked improvements in our outcomes here. But that doesn't mean we can rest. So we said, what can we do to help move this forward, and what are some of the recommendations from a policy perspective that we might see? As I mentioned before, the first one that jumps out to me is the use of default and nudge options, and you could argue this is exactly what Australia and the UK have done, and the US to some extent with auto-enrollment and auto-escalation. But back to the putting together your car analogy, I think if I kind of had a revelation one day and said, at least in the U.S., the way the defined contribution system works, you go to work your first day and they say, great, we're glad you're here. We have a great retirement plan. Here's all the information. See you later. Good luck with that. And you're expected to know what decisions to make, how much to save, how to invest the money, how to accumulate the money, and then how to spend the money down once you retire. And just think if instead, and in this day and age, we know a lot about people. If we know how old you are, we know how much is in your defined contribution account, we know how much you might expect from your Social Security program. We may even have access to how much you've saved outside from prior employers or other defined contribution plans. With a little bit of information, we can do a lot of positive things, and we could actually shoot for a target income level at retirement and determine that and say, look, we're going to auto-enroll you at your own personal percentage of savings rate. And then we're going to monitor that throughout your working lifetime and adjust that as needed. So if you want to put this on autopilot, good decisions will be made for you throughout your career. And I think that would get many people a lot closer to what they need than the way it works now, where either you're left to make all your own decisions, or in the default, where we default everybody at the same rate, that has some shortcomings as well. It's like, we have good news and bad news. The good news, we're giving everybody new shoes. Bad news is everybody's getting size 6. So some people will be very happy, and that'll be just right. But the majority of people are going to have a problem with that. So I think we can design programs going forward in ways that will make it a lot easier for people to start from a position that makes sense for them, and then they would have every ability to change that outcome, those decisions, to better suit them, to better reflect their own personal preferences and information. But if they don't, and that's what we find, people tend to do what we nudge them to do, then we'll have a lot better outcomes. And I really think this has to be a key to any any program or any social policy that we adopt going forward, and to fine-tune that. The second recommendation is around our social programs. And at least in the U.S., this is a big challenge with our political system to make sure programs stay relevant and fresh and on point. We need, and timely. So I think if we can put in, make sure that these programs are monitored regularly, updated regularly, and not only reactive to the problem of the day, but to start to anticipate the future needs of these programs, I think we'll be a lot better off. We're clearly in societies that are aging. Saw that the UK is a bit ahead of the U.S. in terms of the population already over 65. Japan, I think, is the farthest one out there. We can learn globally from each other and really start to anticipate the changing needs with people living longer, with older populations and less younger populations to support that group, to put in programs that anticipate future needs and not just reactive to past needs, and done so on a timely basis. And then the third recommendation is one of financial education. And I believe there's studies out there that show that educating people in and of itself is not going to be the answer here. As I talked about, there's that one population that no matter how much education, this just isn't what they enjoy doing and are comfortable doing. But having said that, I still think we are a long way from making that effort. I think these need to be targeted education pieces. This study helped highlight the differences in ages and gender and income levels. So the financial material needs to be targeted at the right audience. It needs to start early in primary education and throughout the full education, including the workplace. People see their employers as a key provider. We're seeing the increase in growth and evolution of financial wellness programs here in the U.S., which I'm excited about. I started out spending a lot of time talking about retirement readiness and realized pretty quickly that when you get to the younger population and you talk to them about retirement readiness, their eyes are going to glaze over, and there's other things they're worried about in terms of paying for university, buying a home, buying a car, and paying off debt. And so if we stop at retirement readiness, we're going to miss a significant part of our audience. So we need to be really thoughtful and smart about how we do this. We continually educate people. I promised I'd come back to this group of middle income and middle age. I got a little target on this chart there. And not that we can ignore all the other pieces of this grid, but some would argue that the higher income groups, and for our study, we said higher income was the top 20%, middle was middle 40, and lower 40. But we can't. The higher income group has more resources to provide for retirement, even if they don't do the planning. So there's less, arguably less need to spend trying to help the higher income group. The lower income group, the social programs are aimed to target that group. The data in the U.S. shows that a large percentage of the population rely exclusively on Social Security. I forget the stats, but there's another group that 90% of their income comes from Social Security. And not that Social Security is perfect and going to be the answer and they don't need to save, but that provides some of the comfort there, which leaves that middle income group and with the most challenge there, where I think the policies and changes can help. And then when you look at it from an age category, the younger people, we all know that the sooner you start saving, the better. And retirement, another funny thing about retirement saving is one of the things you can't turn back the hands of time. So if you didn't save for your first 10, 15, 20 years of employment, you can't magically say, oh, I'm going to go back and start saving now. That time is gone. So it still is important for the younger group, but that middle age group, which is coming up to retirement, really needs to focus on this and put some programs in place. And the older group has less time. I've done some work in a prior life where we looked at retirement readiness for a whole population of for a certain given employer, and some of the amount of savings needed by that older population was fall out of your chair, high numbers. And so we need to get that message sooner, and not that there's lost cause, but they've got a bigger mountain to climb to get things ready to retire, which explains the transformation that we found in the survey of people saying, look, I'm just not going to retire. I'm going to keep working. So with that, we thought we'd take a step back. I'm going to turn it back to Rebecca to talk a little bit about the UK, and then I'll come back and some higher observations about the US. Rebecca, back to you.
Thanks, Ted. So I think it's fair to say the overarching takeaway for the UK is that we must do better. We're lagging behind on pretty much every aspect of preparing for retirement. A few particular lowlights. UK respondents were least well informed, least likely to be saving sufficiently, and least likely to have any contingency plans in place should their circumstances change. And when we couple this with the fact that over half of UK respondents are anticipating a poor or modest lifestyle in retirement, it kind of begs the question, why are people not preparing and they're seemingly resigned to a poorer quality of life in retirement? Our results do suggest, though, that workplace pensions could play a really pivotal role in turning this around. We have the highest rate of assumed dependency on the state pension and the lowest level of personal savings, but we have very similar levels of saving into an occupational pension as those respondents in Australia and the US. And we're already seeing the really positive effects of automatic enrolment. As I mentioned earlier, we're anticipating 10 million more people to be saving by 2020 as a result of auto-enrolment. But the next challenge is really going to be whether we can get people saving enough. And here we could look to either or both Australia and the US. So in the US, and I understand that you've had a number of successful schemes that have had the Save More Tomorrow features, so people agree to saving more should they get any increases in their salary in the future, so that when it happens, that increase happens automatically. And in the Australia, the model they've taken is to increase the minimum contribution levels to way above where we are in the UK. Also, the high level of reliance on the state pension in the UK highlights the importance of the fact that the new state pension was set just above the basic level of means-tested support, so that we're really able to provide an adequate safety net for future pensioners. But our results do also suggest that it's important the state pension remains adequate, because there was scepticism amongst the young that the current system is sustainable and will be a source of income that's available to them when they retire. So we really need to strike that balance between making sure the state does provide that safety net, where there's a high level of anticipation that it will, but also not creating a system that we're not able to sustain. I don't want us to be too hard on the UK, despite us faring worse than in Australia or the US, because here in the UK, we're relatively new to the idea of not having an income generated from our DC pension provider. And actually, many of the older respondents may have defined benefit pensions as well. And the fact that people were least likely to know how they're going to withdraw and budget their savings in retirement could simply be because we're still getting our heads around the idea that those savings are not going to be annuitised. But these 10 million more extra savers are now going to be responsible for mitigating their own investment, inflation, and longevity risk. And they don't seem to have any idea of how they're going to do this. And this is of real concern here in the UK amongst people here at the IFOA, amongst the pensions industry, and it's a real concern amongst the government and regulators. In fact, at the moment, the Work and Pension Select Committee, which is a parliamentary committee here in the UK, is running an inquiry as to whether the freedom and choice reforms are meeting their policy objectives, and we at the IFOA will be responding to that. And the Financial Conduct Authority, who regulates contract-based schemes here in the UK, is partway through its retirement outcomes review, where it's gathering evidence of what people are doing now that the reforms are in place and assessing whether that means the current consumer protections and regulatory framework is up to speed. To touch on the 3 points that come from our report, so the role around defaults versus financial education. That's something that we really need to improve here in the UK too. We're currently combining all of our various guidance bodies into a single body so that we can have a cohesive, comprehensive strategy for providing guidance and helping to educate people as they approach retirement and then once they're in retirement. And industry is also trying to respond by helping to create appropriate defaults with Nest, the scheme that's been mentioned already a couple of times in this presentation, recently publishing a blueprint for decumulation where it looked at really innovative ways of combining the freedoms that we're seeing are really popular here in the UK with having some level of guaranteed income. We know anecdotally from surveys that if you ask someone what they want from a pension, that's what they want, a guaranteed income that will last them a lifetime. But at the same time, they don't want to pay for an annuity. So we're really grappling in the UK with how we establish defaults that can combine those two elements. So with that, back over to you, Ted.
All right, thanks, Rebecca. And I agree. I think one of the biggest emerging issues is this drawdown piece. I think I'm optimistic we're going to have people be able to save more, but people are really going to struggle with how do I make it last. And from our survey, their ability to manage the plan for risks and handle that too is going to be a big challenge for us. So it'll be interesting to watch. A couple final thoughts on the U.S. We've got a number of things going on currently or upcoming as well that will impact our retirement readiness through our programs. The first I'd mentioned before, the Social Security is projected to run short of funds by 2034. These are calculations done by the Social Security Administration's actuaries, and they update that report every year, but it's been pretty consistent. And while it doesn't sound in ways it's lifetimes away in terms of political elections, it's not that long away, and the longer we wait before we decide on how to address the shortfall, the harder the solutions become too, and the cutback, if nothing is done and benefits are just cut to reflect the amount of income available, the benefit cuts could be as much as 20% or more. So it's not insignificant. And how that would get cut and who would get cut is a whole other ordeal. So Social Security is something that needs to be addressed sooner or later, hopefully sooner. The second thing is, as we speak, tax reform is a very hot topic in the U.S., and one of the feature programs that's being addressed today. There's a big question about how retirement will fare in any kind of tax reform. So far, it appears that one of the areas that is particularly vulnerable is the pre-tax ability to save on a pre-tax basis into your company-provided accounts or personal accounts, for that matter. And so far, that seems to be out of the fray of nobody's going to touch that. But I think everybody's a bit nervous that it represents a potential way to fund some of the other tax cuts that are being proposed, and so people are quite concerned about the ultimate impact on retirement through the tax reform process. The third area is an acknowledgement. I mentioned before that access is a problem, and that those who do have access to employer plans tend to save more than those that don't. And so the states here in the U.S., many of the states have been taking on their own efforts to offer statewide programs with perhaps mandatory deferrals or at least automatic deferrals that you can opt out of to generate more savings. I think generally people feel if there were a federal program to do that, that would be a bit more optimal. But otherwise, we could end up with a patchwork of 30, 40, 50 different programs across the U.S. But clearly an area that's been identified, and hopefully we'll continue to see progress. And then the fourth part here is the automatic features continue to evolve, continue to become more popular. They don't fit every single employer, where there's some plans where the contribution rates are extremely high already, and they wouldn't benefit from this. But as I said, I think the default of picking 3% or some flat low rate is sending the wrong message, and we'll see that evolve, or hope to see that evolve as these things emerge. Target date funds is another really popular feature where a significant amount of assets now go to target date funds that automatically adjust, knowing how old you are, the risk levels in your investments, and those more and more are going through retirement, not just to the retirement date, so people can leave their money in there even during retirement. One concern about these changes, though, which are all positive things or potentially positive, is that we're doing them, in my opinion, in a little bit of a disjointed and piecemeal approach. And it dawned on me that there really is no, at least for the U.S., national retirement policy. How are all these programs supposed to work together? What is the real objective of Social Security? Is it more social adequacy or individual equity? In fact, at the Academy, we're working on a project to be able to compare those for Social Security proposals as they come out in the coming years. And it would be a lot better if we were able to take a step back now, clearly identify where we want this to go, and then start to tweak Social Security, start to tweak tax reform, taxes, our tax program, and the employer-provided piece, so we come up with coordinated solutions moving ahead. So, Ken, I think back to you at this point to wrap us up.
All right. Thanks, Rebecca and Ted. So a quick recap. I think there is a legitimate question in each of our three countries as to whether we're facing a retirement crisis or just a retirement challenge. I'd say that pretty clearly our survey results show that we have a challenge, and I think it could become a crisis. While we have three countries, three different cultures and approaches towards retirement, the survey indicates that we're all somewhat similarly situated. And it suggests to us that the preparation for retirement, might go beyond national culture and policies and be heavily related to very human behaviors like procrastination, clinging to the status quo, behaviors that are not regulated by national boundaries and kind of encompassed in that field of behavioral economics. I liked Ted's comment that people are people, and we kind of see that through the survey results. It also suggests that any solution can't ignore the status quo, and we need to reflect the existing framework in each country's retirement policies. Clearly, political policymakers and employers can and should play more important roles in developing and implementing solutions. And in that regard, it should be noted that there have been changes in all three countries that increase retirement preparation. In Australia, we have the increase in the superannuation contributions, and as Ted and Rebecca have mentioned, we have the auto features in the UK and the US. But the bottom line is that we all believe that progress in retirement readiness is possible, but beyond that, it's necessary, and it's becoming more and more critical. And certainly we hope this report is going to stir some action among policymakers in our three countries. So our paper is available by following either the Academy link for the U.S. or the Institute and Faculty link in the U.K. And I'll simply add that what we've provided today is just a very high-level review of the overall results. The paper, which I hope you'll download, will put a great deal more meat on those bones. So with that, We've got time for maybe a couple of questions. We've gotten a lot of questions. So looking at those, one that I think is interesting, kind of a series of questions. And Steve, I'm going to direct this to you. It says, after you got survey results back, what questions do you wish you'd have asked? And then there were other questions about kind of the methodology and data that we underlying the survey. So obviously this is from someone who's had survey experience. So Steve, you want to comment on that?
Sure. Thanks very much, Ken. Before I answer the question about what I wish we had asked, let me answer a few of the questions that came from participants today. One person asked whether the elderly benefits that we showed as a percent of GDP for the three countries included employee contributions. And the answer is it does not, because that elderly benefits only includes governmental benefits. So it does not include employer nor employee contributions. That is a large part of the reason why Australia, which relies heavily on the superannuation requirement through private employers, is lower on those than the U.S. and the U.K. A few people asked about what the sample size was. What I'll say is we used a very reputable international polling firm that sampled a nationally representative sample of people 18 to 64 in each of the three countries. Altogether, we had about 3,000 respondents, somewhat fewer in Australia, somewhat more in the UK, with the US in the middle. Finally, a couple people asked whether we asked specifically about awareness of longevity risk in our survey, and the answer is we did. We asked both whether people were aware of it and also whether they had done anything to plan for it. With respect to both of those, we found relatively low percentages. The percentages that were aware and or had planned increased both with age and income, but were still relatively low, even for those nearing retirement and of higher income. Finally, let me answer Ken's direct question about what I wish we'd asked. There are several things. I think the most important that I wish we'd asked is about financial literacy. Various other research recently has started looking at people's financial literacy, which does not mean, actuarial level of expertise, simply a basic understanding of things like compounding, interest rates, et cetera. And that there's a relatively small set of questions that measure people's financial literacy, that often is a powerful predictor of whether or not people plan effectively for retirement. Given that one of the most striking results here is how similar three very different countries are, I wonder whether financial literacy is actually very similar in all three countries. The nice thing about financial literacy is that financial education can help do something about financial literacy. So I wish we'd done something about that. There is also some evidence that women are less financially literate than men for all sorts of reasons. And so if we had measured financial literacy, it might have given us some clue as to whether that's what's accounting for the, again, somewhat surprising persistence in the difference between men and women across countries, age, and income. Ken, you want to follow up with a couple more of the questions we received?
Okay, sure. Again, I'll try to put a few of these together. Rebecca, I kind of agreed with Ted's assessment that the survey indicated almost a defeatist attitude, and we've had some questions around that, and we see that particularly in the UK. Do you have any thoughts on why that is?
Yeah, sure. I will try to keep this brief because we don't have long, but I think there's three main contributing factors, and they're actually picked up on one of the questions. I think the three factors are the economic climate, reducing confidence in expectations throughout the whole of the lifetime, not just in retirement, the prevalence of recent pension reforms and public perceptions of those reforms, and sensationalist media headlines. So just looking at those in a bit more detail. It's only recently in the UK that the government's moved away from this rhetoric of us having to have austerity measures in order for us to be able to continue with that ongoing recovery from the 2008 financial crisis. Couple that with the fact that the working age population is struggling to get on the housing ladder, and earlier this year railway wage growth here was negative. So from this perspective alone, it's easy to see why UK respondents may have a bleak outlook. You combine that with the pension freedoms, leading to an increasing number of headlines about pension scams and changes to the state pension age, leading to lots of media coverage and political debate about people having to work for longer, and as a result, people feeling that they're missing out. All in all, this has helped to foster a greater sense of mistrust in the pension system. And it also doesn't help that over the last year to 18 months, we've had a couple of high-profile employers and their pension schemes fail, so BHS and Tata Steel. So I think it's very much a reflection of the economy, the policy environment, and the stories that are hitting the headlines here in the UK.
Okay, so I hate to paraphrase the one questioner, but are we suggesting there's fake news in the U.S. and UK? Don't answer. Again, I'm going to apologize because we did get a lot of questions and we just don't have the time to hit them. But one of the themes of the questions, too, that came out was, we've talked about default tools and financial education, and I put those at the extremes of the how can I take care of myself spectrum out there. And I think one of the big issues is longevity risks that people have asked about in the questions. And where does that fit on this spectrum? And I've looked at this a lot, and the Academy has looked at this a lot. And I think it's very difficult to provide meaningful education for people to fully understand financial risk. Other than taking actuarial exams, it seems to be hard to understand. One of the things that is out there that I want to tout is the Society of Actuaries and the Academy work together to create the Longevity Illustrator. And if you haven't looked at that, I suggest you do that and recommend it to non-actuaries to take a look at. And for our IFOA members joining us today, you can record your CPD by logging on to the member area of the IFOA website. And to obtain proof of your attendance, please email Rebecca, whose email address is shown here, rebecca.deegan@actuaries.org.uk. So I want to thank everyone for your attendance, and we hope this has been useful information for all of you.